but the only people who would be recorded are the ones who are speaking. Okay, let's get started. This presentation will be by Dr. Kelly Gross, Disability, Inclusion, and Representation in Visual Arts Classrooms. So, Dr. Gross, I'm gonna hand it over to you, and you have screen sharing privileges, just so you know.
So there we go. That should be in presentation mode. So of course, like everyone, you put something in and then you change the title a little bit. So I apologize that the title changed slightly from when I submitted this. And before I get started in talking about this work, I wanted to comment on something that I think it was Dr. Wilson who said in the last session, was commenting about how people's research and how people's practice had been impacted by the pandemic. And most of the work I do is work that occurs in classrooms, research in classroom settings in K-12 schools. And that is something that's very near and dear to my heart and important to me. So this research somewhat developed out of a need to get more information to do that kind of research, but also a response to two research studies that I had in the spring that had to be halted because I couldn't be in a classroom anymore and our schools were closed. So what I'm going to be talking about today is information and, research from a survey that I did of Illinois K-12 classrooms. And so what I'm really thinking about in this session, or what I'm thinking about in this research, is issues of representation, disability studies, and application to K-12 settings, which realistically, there's a real theoretical framework that's different between approaches to special education that occur in K-12 schools and theoretical framework approaches within disability studies. And so I'm not going to get into that in super detail today, but I'm trying to start kind of examining the crossover and the intersection between these areas. So, okay. So in 2006, the United Nations passed the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which required that nation states ensure an inclusive education system at all levels. What inclusion means and looks like varies considerably based on local and state policy. And as Baglieri and Shapiro explain, inclusive education approaches can take many forms, including an individual approach to difference, pluralism as social practice, diversity as curricular practice, and curricular pedagogies. Researchers in art education have explained that equitable inclusion must move beyond merely including people with disabilities in classrooms, but also include the perspectives of people with disabilities in art and design education curriculum through art, narratives, and terminology. This study examines how inclusivity theories have translated to the inclusion of representations of disability in K-12 visual arts curriculum. The study was a descriptive survey that was part of a more extensive study examining inclusive approaches related to disability. In the spring of 2020, a digital survey was sent to art teachers in Illinois. Initially, the survey was sent via email to 876 teachers and later distributed via social media platforms. And the survey received an initial 163 full responses, of which 12 were from social media. Therefore, the response rate for emails was at 17.2%. However, only 153 participants identified as teaching visual art or design to PK through 12 students. And therefore, the results from the study are from a sample size of n equals 153. Just some information about the participants. So participants self-identified the location of their school as large urban for 18.5% of respondents, small urban for 11.25%, suburban for 52.98%, and rural for 17.22%. The schools that participants taught in were mainly public at 87.42%. Almost 10% were private, 2% selective enrollment public, and 1.3% were charter. There was a fairly even distribution of grade levels taught with a slight skew towards elementary. Teachers were asked to report on various questions that illustrate how students with disabilities are receiving visual arts instruction and what the makeup of art classes look like in terms of students with disabilities. 95% of students with IEPs are in the educational environment described as regular schools, making up 14.6% of the general population of students attending public schools in Illinois. Researchers have acknowledged that visual arts education is often one of the primary places where students with disabilities are placed for an inclusive setting, which may lead to a higher than average number of students with disabilities in some classes. Teachers were initially asked to describe the percentage of students they teach with visual art and design with an IEP plan. The largest group of teachers identified a percentage range that aligns with the state statistic, with 52% of teachers reporting that students with disabilities are overrepresented in their visual art and design classrooms. Almost 25% of teachers reported teaching a class where there is a smaller percentage of students with IEP plans. And teachers most commonly reported these classes were high school classes such as advanced art, advanced placement, or IB classes. Additionally, almost 17% of teachers reported teaching a class where all of the students have an IEP. This data suggests that visual art and design teachers are likely to teach a disproportionately high number of students with disability. Advanced level classes in the high school are likely to have a smaller number of students with disabilities, and self-contained classes for students with disabilities in visual arts are consistently being taught. When visual art and design educators were asked to consider how often they include artists and designers with disabilities as part of their curriculum, 129 participants responded. The respondents chose never at 17.83%, some of the time at 58.91%, about half the time at 16.28%, most of the time at 3.88, and always at 3.10. Teachers also identified additional means they use to include representations of disability as part of their curriculum. For this question, teachers were allowed to choose as many categories as fit, and out of the 145 responses on this question, they identified the following uses of media: movies, 27 teachers; comics or graphic novels, 26; literature, 12; children's books, 50; media advertising, 21; and other, 9. For other, teachers identified scholastic art, Art 21, tattoo artists, YouTube, and self-made PowerPoints as other sources for teaching about artists and designers with disabilities. When asked to identify artists with disabilities that they included as part of their curriculum, teachers overwhelmingly identified Chuck Close as the most frequently included artist. The artist list included artists with physical disabilities, vision impairments, ASD, learning disabilities, and mental health illness. These artists create in a wide range of media. Another 35 artists beyond the list that's on this slide were also uniquely identified by teachers as artists or designers with disabilities they included as part of their curriculum. Rather than listing artists, 3 teachers listed self-taught and another 3 listed unsure. 5 teachers commented that this was not something they usually considered. And 2 teachers stated they had never considered this before. Another 2 stated this is a good idea. and said they had never looked to see if the artists have a disability. When asked whether they identified the disabilities of the artists or designers to students, 119 teachers responded. Teachers overwhelmingly said yes, with 76%, with a smaller percentage selecting maybe, 16%, and some selecting no at 6%. In a follow-up short answer prompt, teachers were asked why they do or do not identify the disability. 105 teachers responded with answers that fell into 6 main categories, identified by keywords or concepts: empathy, identity, normalized differences, part of the artwork, artist stories, and success, or 2 more, success, perseverance, overcome, and do not identify. And I realized I didn't put the numbers for the success, perseverance, and overcome, which was 45. That was the largest category, and do not identify as 12. For those who chose to give a reason why they do not identify an artist's disability, responses fell into 2 main categories. First, some teachers clearly stated they did not want the artist defined by disability, and other teachers worried about drawing attention to students with disabilities in their classroom, stating, "I don't want to spotlight students who are mainstreamed." Teachers who mentioned empathy were concerned with students without disability empathizing with people with disabilities. Comments about normalizing and differences included to make disabilities seem not so different, normalize differences, and to reduce stigma around disabilities. Are teachers' positive attitudes regarding the ability of people with disabilities in visual arts? Comments in this category most commonly featured the words everyone, anyone, success, achievement, perseverance, and overcome. Many comments contain the words everyone, anyone, and success achieved together, including anyone can be successful, and everyone can be an artist. Successful people can have a disability. Comments that included the phrase perseverance seem to suggest that perseverance may be necessary when someone has a disability, and that identifying an artist's disabilities may demonstrate perseverance. Teachers stated phrases such as shows perseverance and grit or perseverance that was needed to not let disability stop them. The phrase overcome was mostly used about overcoming obstacles in phrases such as, it is important for students to see the obstacles people have overcome to do what they do, or it does show how the person has overcome challenges to create and it can give inspiration. Overall, it suggests that art teachers who chose to identify disability do so for various reasons. Some perceive this important to understand the artist's work or process, while others perceive the inclusion of artists with disabilities as an avenue to empathize and a means to normalize differences. The largest group of respondents described the reasons for identifying a disability as a means to highlight the success of individuals with disability and inspire students to persevere through obstacles. Simondou describes the difference between disabled people doing art and disability art as an important distinction, and that disabled people doing art is any non-political art produced by disabled people, while disability art shares the experience of disability. Furthermore, disability art is focused on living with an impairment and is often seen as educative, transformative, expressive, and participatory, as it represents the perspective of disability from someone who has a disability. The idea of disabled people doing art can become problematic when introduced into curricula when it is purely about admiring people who create artwork despite their impairment. Researchers in disability studies have argued that disability arts have the ability to advance disability culture and claim disability aesthetics. And others have said that the inclusion of disability arts in inclusive curricula counteracts the exclusion, marginalization, and discrimination of people with disabilities. The survey results suggest that some artists being included are making art that falls within the category of disability arts, including the second most frequent artist listed, Frida Kahlo. Nevertheless, further inclusion of disability arts could be achieved. A repeated response on the survey was the idea of the inclusion of artists with disabilities as a means to teach perseverance. When non-disabled people depict disability, they can fall back on dominant stereotypes of disability. One stereotype that exists in both movies and literature is the narrative that people with disabilities can cure themselves through sheer force of will. The contrast between art teachers' sincere intent to be inclusive and inspiring and the problematic narrative that some reinforce illustrates the need for further inclusion of disability arts. The educators' responses regarding the inclusion of representation of disability in art and design classroom reveal insights into how the implementation of inclusion has moved beyond inclusion as a placement in a particular setting to curricular practices that include the representation and perspective of people with disabilities. As described by Simondu, a genuine commitment to inclusive education and art and design education engages students with disability arts. In learning more about individual artists, students can learn how the subject matter of their work and the process of creating the work are impacted by differences related to disability. More importantly, the inclusion of disability art as part of the curriculum can serve to illustrate the many ways that people can inhabit, perceive, and represent the world around them. This has important implications for students to understand their own divergence and differences. And I realize that I've talked a little fast at this point, so I'm going to stop my sharing. I often do this, so I apologize. But I guess I'm like 2 minutes fast. So I wanted to open it up to questions. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, you're Hillary?
I'm Hillary, yeah.
Okay.
So you had a little picture book on one of the slides. I think it was
El Defo.
Oh yeah, can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I teach a course to pre-service teachers on disability and disability in K-12 classrooms. And so one of the things that I do is I have students they have to independently read a graphic novel or a comic on disability and then report on it into the class. And so, I noticed in the responses that there were quite a few people who mentioned comics or graphic novels as a source for talking about disability with their students. And this is something that I've emphasized over the years. So El Defo is a book that's aimed, I think, for like 3rd through 5th grade. And it's written by Cece Bell, who's became deaf through, I forget, she had a childhood illness that caused her to lose her hearing. And so it talks about the experience of disability and growing up. And she also had this thing called like a phonic ear that she used. And so I think those books and are talking about it in class when I do it with my students is really about understanding the different ways that disability can be represented. And we talk about the different perspectives of disability, whether the books are written by somebody with this disability, which they often are, or by a sibling or a relative of somebody with disability, which tends to be the other main category. So, one of the things I did not do on this survey, but I'm currently applying for a grant to do it as a larger survey, is I really didn't gather enough information on those kind of like other categories. I just asked. And I was surprised at the number of people that said children's books and graphic novels. And so one of the things that I'm going to do next time with the larger survey is gather some more information on that.
Thanks. So I had one more question. I don't want to hog all the time if anyone else does. Okay. So your study, you said, is in Illinois.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I have been doing lessons recently with my students integrating social and emotional learning, so I think it was the Ohio has a social and emotional learning framework.
We do in Illinois as well.
Yeah. Okay. And
yeah.
do you have any do you use it or?
So we talk about social emotional learning in my class on looking at disability in K-12 classrooms. And so, my background is that I used to teach students with emotional disabilities. So I'm particularly interested in social emotional learning and that growth. Illinois requires the SEL standards be taught, but there's no kind of direction over where those are taught or through what classrooms. So that's something that, we're working to do, to look at the ways in which art classrooms provide opportunities for social emotional learning. And I think there's a lot of structures in art classrooms that are unique, and in terms of the ability to converse and dialogue, to share differing opinions, the kind of critiques that can happen in art rooms, even at young levels. And the other thing in art classrooms, which we all know, is that it's one of the few places where students, there's no clear answers, right? The students have to learn to make qualitative judgments. And so I think one of the things that I always try to emphasize to my students is that we can't expect anyone to know how to do something without practice. And so one of the things that we can do in art classrooms is to help kids learn how to make choices and to understand the implications of those choices. And it may be something small, like, how do I apply this paint? And it may be something bigger about like content or how you talk about someone's work or something. But the more we practice and provide opportunities for making choices, the more students will develop the skills in how to make good choices in their own lives. Does that answer your question at all?
Thank you.
Okay.
I think there's a couple more in the chat.
So Jenny asked if I have any resources that I can share for finding artists that make artwork that I would consider in the disability arts category. So that's a great question. I have a list of artists that I let my students do research about, my pre-service students. But one of the things that I think became highlighted to me in this research was, if I go back to that list of who art teachers identified as artists with disabilities to teach about, the number one person's Chuck Close. And I don't really consider Chuck Close as somebody who's doing disability arts. And there is this kind of like, clearly, and there's this weird discussion, or not discussion, but I kind of get into this like theorizing about, well, how can we decide what is impacted by disability and what is about disability? Because for instance, like Chuck Close talks about that once he really had, major vision and his shoulder injury, that he couldn't work up close with her work and he started to step back. And that's when he really started to make large scale sculptures. So I don't tend to distinguish as much in that list about who's doing disability arts and whose work is influenced by disability, because I think there's a lot of context around that. But I think the thing that this research made apparent to me, that's a project that I'm looking to do in the next year, is to do some work on instructional resources on artists, like disability artists, or artists who really focus on disability arts, to be incorporated in the classroom. So that is as soon as I start, I can give you the list I have, but it's something that I think needs to be done, so in our field. There's also a great book out that Alice Wexler and John Derby edited on contemporary art and disability studies. And that book has some great resources in it. That's an excellent book too that I would recommend. Okay, and then Kaylee asked, I'm wondering if you could speak about how, if you instruct pre-service teachers around the tensions between special education and disability studies, and how they can navigate these potential tensions in school settings. Yeah, so this is clearly a big issue. So, one of the things that I've done is I've switched texts that I use in my classroom. So I use a book written by Baglieri called Disability Studies in the Inclusive Classroom. And that book is not written from art education, although it does talk about issues like media representation and representation of disability. So that book is kind of our entrance for talking about this. And one of the things that we talk about in our class is this tension that exists, that I really function from a capability approach. I believe that we provide students with opportunities, that if we deny students the opportunities, then we're denying them the capability to develop skills and concepts and participation in the arts. And special ed, of course, is operating from a deficit approach, where it's really looking at what are students missing, let's fix that. And I don't see that as the way in engaging students in art. I like to build on students' strengths and their interests. So, you know, we talk about those tensions because the reality is that as teachers in public schools, when they receive IEPs, they're mainly going to be written from a deficit approach. You know, sometimes there's an asset section on there, but rarely. If there are assets, it's rarely about art. I mean, it's usually something else like, oh, you know, Sophie's really pleasant to work with or something. You know, it's not this student has an interesting way of looking at the world, or, you know, the way that there's nothing like that usually in IEPs. So I don't have answers to that, but I think that's, you know, the tension that I'm interested in investigating is how we can take the theory and the research coming out of disability studies and what the implications are for K-12 classrooms. Oh, thank you, Kaylee, for putting the Wexler and Derby book in there. That's a really excellent book if anybody's looking for resources. I think there's only about 2 minutes left. Are there any other questions?
Kelly, thanks. This is really interesting. I'm working with a grad student right now who's researching school settings and autism. And one of the things that a conversation we've been having, and maybe you could articulate it from your research, is the difference that you see in the ways that researchers speak from their positionality if they are a disabled person, if they identify as a disabled person, or if they're a relative, or if they are neither. Because she's coming from the positionality of a relative, so she's cared for her sister since her whole life. Yeah. But in a lot of the research, it is like you're saying here, it's talking about who's represented and who's speaking. And I was just wondering if you had how you identify differences in like the sort of tone or the language from those positionalities.
Yeah, so, you know, I think it's the question which, you know, gets at the heart of good research in general. Are you doing research about? Are you doing research with? Are you doing research, you know, in a way that's also self-representational? And so, you know, I certainly, traditionally speaking, the field of special education is much more research about, right? It's that position of the outsider. We know what's best. And I think when you're looking at ASD and you know, the spectrum, a lot of the stuff about, like, for instance, adaptive behavior and some of the therapies for ASD, you know, that were considered best practices, which really were about normalizing behaviors. People who with ASD who grew up with those therapies, who are now able to speak to that, have really spoken out about how damaging those therapies are and how, and I think that's led to a lot of insight about, you know, changing the way that maybe some people are approaching working with students with autism. Within disability studies, I think you see people a larger percentage, a much larger percentage of people within disability studies are people who identify as disabled, or who have a much more personal experience with disability. That being said, I think there are people who are both. Like, I think there are people with disabilities working in special ed, and I think there are people who maybe have strong experience with disabilities that inform work in disability studies. But I think that if you don't have a disability, you always need to be conscious of that writing about or writing with, and that you need to put strong kind of, I don't want to say controls, but, you know, things in place to make sure that you know, what you're saying aligns with people's perspectives from the disability community. And that being said, you know, I think that's true of any research. But I also think it's important to recognize that, especially with something like autism, because it is a spectrum, you can talk to two people who fall on the spectrum who have really different perspectives of that. And so, you know, this is why so much of the work with disability and special education is like single case studies or very small case studies, because it's really just hard to generalize. And I think it's important that when we're doing work that you're careful of those tensions. And we can talk more about it. I'm happy to talk with you.
Thanks, Kelly.
I think that is all the questions, but thank you all for attending Dr. Gross's presentation. We have about 8 minutes until the next presentation.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great Saturday. It looks warmer where some people are than here. Is it Kaylee? Is that your name? I'm just reading your comment.
Yeah.
Okay.